Around 25 million people speak Romanian, and so if you sailed ships into the Black Sea and up the river Danube, stealing a few thousand people from villages, selling them as slaves in North Africa, it would be terrible, but the Romanian language would still be safe. If you sailed to Virginia and took a few thousand English speakers, the English language world would not even feel the loss. It is sad. It is impersonal, but it is true. If you sailed up to Llŷn in Gwynedd and snatched a few thousand Welsh speakers, over the course of even a few decades, that local area of Row would become absorbed out for density of speakers into English. Sad but true, and yet the Welsh language would survive. It would go on, though, in a weakened state. However, imagine a language with just 20,000 speakers or so, as the Cornish language was, in the early 17th century. Having that many people taken would rip the spine out of its heartlands. Wouldn't it? What did happen to the Cornish language as a result of this? Hello, I'm Benjamin. And what would have happened to the Cornish language in this situation? We need to understand two things first. What was the situation of the Cornish language, not only in the 17th century, but in the immediate centuries leading up to it? What did it face? And what was this Barbary slave trade and the Barbary coast it was launched out of? Then with those two things together, we can kind of have a picture of how this may have affected upon the Cornish language. This word, Kenuak. When the Roman Empire was crumbling in the 5th century, Britain was plunged into chaos. The native British language, now a Celtic Latin hybrid language, had already been splitting into dialects for centuries. Slowly, these dialects became languages of their own. After the 6th century, when the Saxon invaders split the southwestern horn of land from the other British speakers, that splitting accelerated, creating the Cornish language. Certainly by the late 9th century. Being next door to Wessex, however, which would in the end dominate England, was not a good place to be. Cornwall was lost as a kingdom in the 10th century. From 1201, when the Stanary Parliament was chartered by King John, to 1536, when the monasteries of Cornwall were suppressed, and then English imposed through the Bible, the Cornish language was remarkably stable. I cannot stress this enough. At a time when the Old Welsh of Scotland and Cumbria's last speakers would have been lost into a distant memory, the Cornish language held its ground and even grew briefly around the year 1400. But the tools of the English state were turned against the Cornish, with uprisings then that were crushed with a harsh hand. And likely never having more than 40,000 speakers, any large loss of life was a big blow. So when the Cornish revolted in 1497, and an army of mostly Cornishmen saw 1,000 lose their lives, I consider this moment to be the beginning of the Cornish language's decline in its heartlands. But where were its heartlands? The leader of the 1497 rebellion, Michael Ngolf. I just need to point out how creepy this guy's name is to me personally because of my own family. The leader of this rebellion's name was Michael Ngolf. My father's name is Michael Angwin. Okay, but as far as Angwin goes, which is a Cornish name, part of this video, I've been thinking about changing the channel name to Benjamin Angwin or Ben Angwin. Let me know. My Patreons seem to agree. I'm not quite sure yet if I'm going to, but I may change the name of the channel. When I began this channel, it was more of like, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know if I want to put my real name out there. But now that it's going from success to success, maybe so. But as for Michael Ngolf, the leader of this rebellion, he came from Enlisarth. I'm not going to say the English name because, I don't know, it's a bit insulting to me that you would demean a region with just calling it an animal name. He was from Lanachevron in Enlisarth. And running up to the northwest, to Lanus, St. Just, where my people are from here, this was the heartland. This would have been the stronghold of the language. Because once you got that far down into the peninsula, the landscape itself forced you to be surrounded by Cornish speakers on all sides. You would not be able to get rid of them. But as I said with the Bible, the English Reformation of the 16th century was fateful for the language. And at that exact moment, when the English language was being forced into the center of Cornish-speaking villages for the first time, against the will of Cornish people, that is when ships from the Muslim world began appearing off the coast of Cornwall, raiding fishing ships and then villages and taking them into slavery. Most of them were never to return home, nor to hear their native language ever again. This is a zebek, used by North Africans to attack Europe and to drag people back to the Muslim world and sell them as slaves. And this is a standard 17th century merchant ship common to the British Isles, the Netherlands, and Northern Europe. As you can see, these are two very different styles. The zebek was designed in Algeria for quick raids across the Mediterranean to attack Christian ports. It was able to swiftly sail up along the west coast of Europe, hugging the coast, using inlets and islands to hide so they could enslave fishermen and steal European children. Naturally, the European powers by 1700 were more technologically advanced than these barbaric pirates in their simple ships. And so in the 18th century, the Muslim pirates of the Barbary coast evolved their methods. But for our conversation, when the Cornish language still had a heartland, the zebek was the ship used. And this would have been very effective on the southern Cornish coast, with its narrow waterways enabling these pirates to evade larger ships. But these ships also had a dark underbelly, which were propelled by slaves, galleys, men forced to row underneath. Europeans were enslaved and then forced to row the ships that took more of their own people. The life of European slaves in the Muslim world was no better than the worst of the lives of the African slaves taken to the Americas. In many cases, it was worse. The conditions were bad. Most European slaves on the Barbary coast died of maltreatment, slow starvation, or disease. And these pirates who enslaved Europeans were called corsairs. You might say, wait a minute, Benjamin, you're not going to pull a fast one on me. Corsair is not Arabic. It's not even Berber. It's French. Yes, it comes from course, fast, or an earlier French kind of racing and race today. The Barbary corsairs operated out of several North African kingdoms. Sometimes these kingdoms were unified, at other times they were ruled by the Ottoman Empire. But in truth, the Turks tended to rule only in name and taxes. Northwest Africa, or the Maghreb, and the Barbary coast were largely outside the rule or law of civilization. Several states rose and fell. The Alawi dynasty of Morocco arose out of the collapse of the Saadi Sultanate, which had kept Morocco free from both Turkish and Portuguese rule. The Regency of Algiers arose out of the Ottoman Empire's wars with the Holy Roman Empire's Habsburg dynasty. The Turks financed Algiers to build fleets, which were then used to attack the gold-carrying ships of the Habsburg-run Spanish Empire, and then to take child slaves from Europe and sell them to the Turks, who raised them as brainwashed warriors to wage jihad upon Christian Europe, or as female sex slaves and arranged wives to produce more children to fight Europe. Tunis and Tripoli were similar to Algiers, but less independent from Ottoman rule than Algiers. From the Atlantic to today's Libya, much of their economy was built on selling slaves to each other and to the Ottomans. However, it must be noted this slave trade was not merely economic. It was part of a religious war against Europe and considered righteous as a form of jihad against the Christians. In the 1620s, having accepted they could not retake Spain until Europe was weaker, the rulers of these Barbary states gave their corsairs legal right to attack Europe and to enslave Christians in the name of Allah. The ruling pashas of the Sultanate had legal right to own 8% of all slaves captured by the corsairs, and so it became a way for ambitious North African men to gain favor with those in power. For Cornwall, a land so open to the sea, so far from the center of power, at a time in the 17th century when England was not a great power, this was bad news. In December 1640, a committee was set up by the English government to get back those taken into slavery in Algiers. Sadly, the wars of the Three Kingdoms broke out, including 2 English civil wars, which was also a blow for the Cornish language. The wars meant resources could not be spent trying to get people back home who had been enslaved. Up to 5,000 English people were slaves in Algiers in 1640 alone. Since Cornwall is so often swept categorically into England, how many of these were Cornish, and how many of those were Cornish speakers? Cornish speakers had become a minority in Cornwall by around the late 15th century, but the land they held in the west was far more exposed to slaver raids. In 1645, a Barbary raid on Cornwall stole 240 men, women, and children. By the 1650s, Cornish fishermen simply refused to go out into the ocean, and it caused a brief shortage in the supply of fish. Oliver Cromwell had to retake the island of Lundy by force from corsairs, who set it up as a base from which to snatch Cornish, English, and Irish people into slavery. The geography of Wales largely protected us, but Cornwall's bays are very open. Samuel Pepys, a writer and chief secretary of the Admiralty and an official in the Navy Board of Parliament, wrote in February of 1661, "Went to the Fleece Tavern to drink, and there we spent till 4 o'clock, telling stories of Algiers, and the manner of the life of slaves there, and truly Captain Moontham and Mr. Dowes, who have both been slaves there, did make me fully acquainted with their condition there, as how they eat nothing but bread and water, how they are beat upon the soles of their feet, and bellies at the liberty of their patron, how they are all at night called into their master's barnyard," that's called into being a prisoner basically, "and there they lie, how the poorest men do use their slaves best, how some rogues do live well if they invent to bring their masters in so much a week by their industry and theft, and then they are put to no other work at all, and that theft there is counted as no great crime at all." The 2 men mentioned here are not specifically Cornish, but it does tell us this was a common topic in the upper military aristocracy of England. This was a serious matter, paralyzing the state, and Cornwall, so exposed to the sea, along with Southern Ireland, took the brunt of these slave raids. They reported in Lanachevron, Baya and Gerek, Penzance, Mousehole, which is probably Moisheile in Cornish. For a language with fewer than 20,000 speakers at the time, how many were lost? Which brings us back to the question, what happened to the Cornish language in this situation? Professor Robert Davis suggests that at least 7,000 English people were taken as slaves from 1622 to 1644, with a figure that may be higher, and a large part of these, if not a majority, would have been taken from Cornwall at a time when the language was in decline. At least 466 ships were taken by Barbary corsairs from 1609 to 1616. Many of those taken were fishermen at sea, and fishermen were the backbone of Cornish industry. Some figures say around 25,000 Britons were taken in the 17th century. However, this figure seems low to me for 3 reasons. 1. The 17th century was horrific in England, and records were not well kept during the wars, and London burned to the ground. 2nd, Cornwall is far away from the centres of governance, and part of what kept Cornish alive is people simply did not know what was going on there. 3rd, we know that Iceland was attacked by corsairs in 1627, and 400 people were taken into slavery, and another raid into Orkney, north of Scotland. Surely this would have meant that slave raids in Cornwall, whose geographic position and geographic layout was so good for them, had exhausted the easy pickings, as we have evidence happened in Spain, with whole villages moving inland. We have cases in Cornwall of whole villages being taken in the middle of the night. That place I mentioned earlier, Mousehole, was where one of the last native Cornish speakers was from, Dorothy Pentreath, who would have been born toward the end of this period. It is probably no coincidence that my own ancestors in Lanús, St. Just, being further inland, kept a Cornish-speaking community for longer, though I accept there are other factors, quite a few here, which led to the demise of Cornish. What we are seeing here during the last generations of Cornish as a dominant community language is the cultural erasure of a minority people in Britain being taken as slaves into the Muslim world. It was fishing communities along Cornwall's south coast, which primarily kept this language as economically vibrant, who suffered most of any place in Britain from these slave raids. As for what this Barbary slave trade did to the Cornish language, there's just not enough work done. We would have to first take apart or separate the English slaves that were taken and the Cornish slaves that were taken as 2 different groups, which are not often categorically separated. And then, within the Cornish group, how many of those were Cornish speakers? And then which villages and towns they came from, and what was the linguistic shift during and after that period? So we don't really know at this point. However, my personal opinion, these slave raiders stole church bells. They were silencing Christianity through more than one means of warfare upon our people. This was a religious jihad into Europe. As for the language, however, I have no doubt in my mind that even though all this language was spoken natively, communally up until the mid-late 18th century, and I have no doubt it would have made it into the mid-late 19th century as a community language of some kind, And that would have been in time to have romantic nationalism, that era, effect upon it. And maybe that would have led to a national revival of the language. I don't know. Do you think it would have? Let me know down in the comments. Thank you very much to my Patreons.